London, St. Margaret's Children's Home. It's a December evening when everything changes. James Crawford, 38 years old, worth $2.8 billion, has come for a routine donation to the oldest orphanage in the city. In the dormitory, 3 children sitting on the bed look at him with hopeful eyes. The youngest, barely 6 years old, whispers a question that will break James's heart. Why doesn't anyone want us? What happens in the next 30 seconds will forever change 4 lives. Because sometimes an innocent question can reveal the deepest truth of our hearts. And James is about to discover that behind his success lies an emptiness that only love can fill. St. Margaret's Children's Home stood majestically in Camden, London, its Victorian red brick walls witnesses to over a century of stories of abandoned children. It was a December evening when James Crawford walked through the main gates, his Savile Row overcoat contrasting sharply with the austere surroundings. At 38, James embodied absolute success in the financial world. His fortune of $2.8 billion had made him one of Britain's most powerful men. Investment funds, wealth management firms, stakes in multinational corporations, everything bore his signature. He had come that evening for the annual donation he made to the home, a gesture more fiscal than altruistic. Sister Margaret, the 70-year-old director with blue eyes full of wisdom, welcomed him into her Spartan office. She showed him the year's accounts, the urgent needs, heating, food, school books. James listened absently, already mentally focused on tomorrow's meeting with Japanese investors. He signed the check without even looking at the amount. To him, it was pocket change. But when he stood to leave, Sister Margaret did something unexpected. In a gentle but firm voice, she asked if he would like to see the children before departing. They were having supper. It would be lovely if he greeted them. James checked his watch. It was already late, but something in the nun's tone convinced him to stay. Perhaps it was guilt over such a cold and distant donation. He followed Sister Margaret down corridors with walls painted in colorful murals, works by the children themselves. The dining hall was filled with small faces bent over plates of pasta and vegetables, the murmur of childish conversations filling the air. The children lifted curious eyes to this elegant man, greeting him with shy smiles. They climbed to the second floor, where the dormitories were separated by age. They stopped before a partially open door, from which warm, soft light filtered. Inside, on 3 small beds arranged side by side, sat 3 children in pajamas, a boy of about 8 with tousled dark hair, a 7-year-old girl with green eyes and long chestnut plaits, and another boy of barely 6, the smallest of the group, with an angelic face framed by blonde curls. Sister Margaret made the introductions. These were Oliver, Sophie, and little Thomas, 3 siblings who had arrived 2 years earlier after their parents died in a car accident. James felt something stir in his chest. 3 siblings who had lost everything, yet managed to stay together. He looked at them sitting on that bed, so small and vulnerable, yet united by a bond that even tragedy hadn't managed to break. Oliver, the eldest, gathered courage and stood from the bed. With the seriousness of one who had been forced to grow up too quickly, he extended his hand to James in greeting. Sophie smiled shyly, hiding her face behind her plaits. But it was little Thomas who changed everything. With the spontaneity typical of children his age, he jumped down from the bed and approached James. He looked up at him with those blue eyes full of innocence and asked the question that would forever shatter the ice armor around the millionaire's heart. The silence that followed was deafening. James felt the world stop around him. In that simple and devastating question lay all the pain of 3 children who couldn't understand why the world had abandoned them. There was no anger in Thomas's words, only naive and painful curiosity seeking an answer that no adult could give. James crouched down to be at the child's eye level, his heart beating hard. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. All his financial expertise, all his entrepreneurial successes hadn't prepared him to answer such a pure and devastating question. He looked into those blue eyes, waiting for an answer, then raised his gaze to Oliver and Sophie, who stared at him with the same desperate hope. In that moment, James Crawford, the man who had everything, realized he was the poorest person in the room. Because he had money, power, success, but had never had what these three children offered freely: unconditional love and the ability to still believe in the goodness of the world. And for the first time in his life, James wondered if it was he who needed them, far more than they needed him. James remained crouched before Thomas for long seconds, searching for the right words. In a voice gentler than usual, he explained that it wasn't true that no one wanted them. Simply the right people hadn't found them yet. Thomas tilted his head to one side, considering the answer with that innocent wisdom only children possess. Oliver approached, placing a protective hand on his little brother's shoulder, apologizing because Thomas always asked too many questions. Sophie joined her brothers, explaining with childish pride how they looked after each other. Oliver helped with difficult homework. She combed Thomas's hair in the mornings, and Thomas always made them laugh when they were sad. James watched these three children who had created their little family the only way they knew how: by protecting each other. There was no self-pity in their words, only a fraternal love so pure it brought a lump to his throat. Oliver, with the precision of one who kept count, revealed they had been there for 2 years, 3 months, and 18 days. Sophie confessed that at first she always cried, but stopped when Oliver told her their parents wouldn't be happy to see her sad. Thomas nodded solemnly, revealing that now they only cried on Thursday evenings, because that was the day Mummy used to cook shepherd's pie. James's heart broke. These children had rationalized their grief, allowing themselves just 1 day a week to remember what they had lost. He had met CEOs with less emotional control than these three little human beings. When Sister Margaret announced he must leave, the three children lined up to thank him with the solemnity of an official ceremony. But James couldn't move. Something inside him had broken irreparably. He asked to stay a bit longer, and the children's eyes lit up. Thus began the most important conversation of James's life. He discovered that Oliver wanted to become a doctor to help people. Sophie dreamed of being a teacher. And Thomas wanted to be an astronaut, to visit the parents who had become stars. Every answer was a small miracle of resilience and hope. These children, who had lost everything, retained a capacity to dream that James had forgotten for decades. When he asked if they wanted to stay together always, they answered in unison, without hesitation. Oliver explained that many families were interested in one of them, but when they discovered they were 3 inseparable siblings, they changed their minds. At that moment, James understood everything. These children hadn't been abandoned because they weren't worthy of love. They had been rejected because they were too much, too many, too bonded, too complicated for most families. But for the first time in his life, James thought that perhaps too much was exactly what he needed. When he finally stood to leave, Thomas ran to him and hugged him tight, asking if he would really return. James looked at that little face full of hope and made a promise that came from the heart. He would return. And for the first time in 30 years, he made a promise that didn't spring from a contract, but from love. That night, James couldn't sleep. In his Mayfair penthouse, surrounded by the finest luxury, he kept seeing 3 small faces looking at him with hope. For the first time in years, he looked around his home and saw what he had always ignored. A cold museum of his success, but not a home. Never had a child's laughter filled these rooms. Never had a drawing decorated the steel refrigerator. Never had a bedtime story been read on the Italian leather sofas. The next day, he canceled all appointments and returned to St. Margaret's. Sister Margaret didn't seem surprised to see him, admitting she knew he would return because that family had something special. James explained what he had in mind. He wanted to adopt all 3 children. The nun listened silently, then gently shook her head. Adopting 3 children wasn't like buying a company, she explained. These little ones needed love, stability, constant presence. James promised he would change everything. He would delegate, hire managers, do whatever was necessary. He couldn't leave them there knowing they could have a family. When Sister Margaret asked why he wanted to do this, James reflected at length. He explained that talking with them had made him feel useful for the first time in years, not for what he could buy or sell, but for who he was. And when Thomas had hugged him, he understood what he was missing. A reason worth living for beyond work. He found the 3 children in the courtyard, under a large oak tree. When they saw him, they ran to him with childhood's typical enthusiasm. He sat with them on a bench and, with his heart beating fast, asked the most important question of his life. How would they feel if someone wanted to adopt all 3 of them together? Their eyes widened with surprise and joy. Oliver, always the most cautious, asked for confirmation that it was really possible to adopt them all together.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
When James revealed he wanted to be the one to adopt them, the silence that followed was different from the previous evenings. It was full of possibilities, of dreams that suddenly seemed achievable. Thomas asked if he would become their daddy. Oliver, with the maturity of one who had already learned that adults could change their minds, wanted to know what would happen if he regretted it. James answered with sincerity that surprised even himself. It wasn't they who needed him, but he who needed them, to learn what it meant to be a family. The 3 children exchanged one of those looks that only siblings can share. Silent communication speaking of absolute trust. After less than a minute, Oliver spoke for all. They didn't need to think about it. They wanted to be his family. At that moment, sitting on a bench in an orphanage, surrounded by 3 children who had decided to trust him, James Crawford realized he had just made the most important deal of his life. And for the first time, it wasn't about money. The months that followed were intense and surprising. James faced the complex adoption procedures with the same determination he used to conquer international markets. Psychological evaluations, home visits, preparation courses for adoptive parents. Meanwhile, he radically transformed his life. He sold the minimalist penthouse and bought a house in Richmond with a large garden, 4 bedrooms, and spaces designed for children. He delegated daily management of his companies, drastically reducing business travel. Every weekend he visited Oliver, Sophie, and Thomas at the home. Initially the children were shy, but gradually they opened up. James discovered that Oliver was a little mathematics genius. Sophie had a natural talent for drawing, and Thomas was an inventor of fantastic stories. When Sophie asked what they should call him, Thomas suggested Daddy James, but Oliver corrected just Daddy if he was going to be their daddy for real. That word resonated in James's heart like a promise and responsibility combined. In May came the good news. All procedures had been approved. The children could finally come home with him. On moving day, the 3 children waited with their small suitcases. Everything they owned fit in 3 canvas bags, but their smiles were worth more than any treasure. During the journey home, Thomas asked if they could put their photos on the fridge, like families on television. James promised they would fill the whole refrigerator. He improvised house rules: eat together when possible, homework before playing, always love each other, even when arguing. Sophie asked if that applied even when Thomas left toys lying around, and James confirmed, even then. The first week was wonderful chaos. James learned that children were noisier than any boardroom, messier than any office, and more demanding than any difficult client. But they were also more rewarding than any professional success. He discovered the pleasure of preparing breakfast for 4, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories. The house filled with laughter, discussions about cartoons, drawings stuck everywhere. One evening, while putting Thomas to bed, the child confessed he had stopped dreaming about parents becoming stars, because now he dreamed they would all be together forever. That night, James understood he hadn't just adopted 3 children. He had gained a purpose, a reason to wake up each morning that went beyond profits. For the first time in his life, James Crawford was truly rich. A year after the adoption, the Richmond house was unrecognizable. The white walls were now covered with colorful drawings, family photos, and school certificates. The garden housed a swing, a table football set, and the vegetable patch Sophie had wanted for her tomatoes. James had discovered aspects of himself he didn't know he possessed. He had become an expert on grazed knees, a connoisseur of cartoons, a cook specializing in spaghetti bolognese and Sunday pancakes. His former colleagues barely recognized the man who now attended school plays and coached Oliver's football team. During one dinner, Oliver observed that he used to think families were only born with biological parents, but now he knew they were a real family, even though they had chosen each other. Sophie, grown and become a little artist, painted portraits of their family. 4 smiling figures in front of the house, often with a sky full of stars representing the biological parents watching over them. Thomas had a habit of introducing James to strangers as "my daddy who chose me from the orphanage, because I'm special." When Sister Margaret proposed writing an article about their story to inspire other adoptions, the children were enthusiastic. Oliver said if their story could help other children find a family, they should make it known. The article had incredible impact. Dozens of families contacted the home asking for adoption information, many declaring themselves ready to welcome groups of siblings. During the interview, when the journalist asked what had been the most important decision of his life, James replied that evening he had understood the real question wasn't why no one wanted those children, but why he didn't want anyone. He had everything money could buy, but not what money can't buy: a family. A year after the article, 23 children from the home had been adopted, many in sibling groups. But for James, the real miracle was daily. Waking up in a house full of laughter, going to Oliver's matches, seeing Sophie's art exhibitions, listening to Thomas's stories. One evening, while helping them with homework, Sophie thanked him for choosing them. James smiled, looking at the 3 treasures who had filled his life with meaning, and replied that they were the ones who had chosen him. 5 years after that meeting that changed everything, the Crawford family had become famous in London not for wealth, but for their story of unconditional love. Oliver, 13, excelled in mathematics, confirming his dream of becoming a doctor. Sophie, 11, had won regional painting competitions. Thomas, now also 11, maintained his creativity and ability to make anyone smile. Above all, they had become a family in the truest sense. They argued and protected each other, shared joys and sorrows, built eternal memories. One Saturday morning, Sister Margaret called with a proposal. The City of London wanted to establish an award for adoptive families who had made a difference, and they would be the first to receive it. The ceremony was held at Guildhall, with the Lord Mayor and many adoptive families. When James took the stage accompanied by his 3 children, he began by recalling that question from 5 years ago. He explained it wasn't true that no one wanted them. The world simply hadn't yet understood how special they were. Looking at the man he had become thanks to them, he could say it wasn't he who had saved them, but they who had saved him. Oliver took the microphone to tell all waiting children not to lose hope, because from the most unexpected families come the most beautiful stories. Sophie added that love is learned together, remembering that their daddy couldn't even cook pasta when he adopted them. Thomas concluded that love doesn't look at whether you're rich or poor, but only whether you have an open heart. That evening, sitting in the garden watching the stars according to their monthly family tradition, the children shared their future dreams. Oliver wanted to adopt children when he grew up. Sophie wanted to make their family keep growing. Thomas, always the most emotional, remembered his question from years before. Now he knew why no one wanted them then. Because they had to wait for James to become the perfect family they had become. James looked at the 3 children who had transformed his existence from a race towards success into a journey towards happiness. 5 years ago, he was London's richest and loneliest man. Now, he was simply Daddy, and he wouldn't trade that title for any other in the world. Hugging all 3 of his children under the stars, James said that love is the only wealth that multiplies when shared, and they were the richest family in the world. That night, 4 hearts beat as one, proving that the most beautiful families aren't born from blood, but from the choice to love each other. And it all began with an innocent question from a 6-year-old boy who had the courage to still believe in love. Has this story moved you? Has it made you reflect on how love can transform lives that seemed destined for loneliness? If you too believe that the truest families are born from the heart, that every child deserves a chance to be loved, and that sometimes an innocent question can change the destiny of 4 people. Like and share this video. Tell us in the comments, do you know adoption stories that have inspired you? Do you believe love is stronger than blood? Do you think we all deserve a second chance to create a family? Subscribe to the channel for more stories celebrating the power of family love, the strength of hope, and the magic that happens when we open our hearts to those who need us. Like, comment, share. Because every story of family found reminds us that true love knows no boundaries, that the greatest happiness comes from giving rather than receiving, and that sometimes 4 words whispered by a child can save 4 lives. Why doesn't anyone want us?